Hello, welcome to another episode of Soul Sessions. Happy Friday. How are you, Rob?
Happy Friday, yeah.
I'm excited because now we are embarking on a new series on personality.
Yes, one of our favorite topics.
So we're going to be talking about personality tests. We're going to be talking about what happens there's a big kind of movement now to talk about trauma all the time. So we're going to do an episode on how to overcome trauma and what that does with the personality and ego and how that works in Jungian coaching. We're also going to talk about being a good person and what does that mean to us and how we define ourselves as a good person and how that limits us in a lot of ways. And then lastly, we're going to talk about just who the true personality is, who we really are. And we're going to, of course, talk about it in every class from a Jungian perspective. But today the topic is, are personality tests ruining your life? Are they? We'll answer that today.
That's right. Yeah, so let's begin with a little background. Because people might know us as Jungian coaches, but they might not know our background. I spent years doing assessment, psychological evaluations. Some of you might not know this.
Did I pass?
Maybe too much. I actually did some testing on you. Right? You passed with flying colors. And so my background, with my academic training, let's say, was heavy into psychological testing. And personality testing is a big part of assessment. So we'll talk about that. There are different models, and there is, of course, a whole slew of pop psychology tests that are out there.
You just scroll through Facebook and find out what your animal totem is or what archetype your dog is, and all these fun tests and
the Big Five,
or
the
your
Meyers-Briggs.
love personality and your success personality, all those things.
Yes.
And then of course the Big Fives, Meyers-Briggs, a lot of the bigger ones, the more the ones that have been around for a long time.
Yeah, and some of the Big Five has a lot of good research behind it. So our purpose is not to dissuade people from using those things, but to deepen the understanding so that they're able to use the information gleaned from some of those personality tests, so that they can improve their mental wellness.
So, just to answer the question, they're not ruining your life, but they could if you're not using them for what they're intended for and understanding the intention, and because they can end up limiting you. We'll talk about that. So, what is a personality? Let's define that term. What is personality?
Yeah, so we go back in history, back to Freud, Jung, Adler, William James in the U.S. These guys, they started kind of the whole idea of this personality and a way of, first of all, conceptualizing it. What is it that's going on when we say that person has a character or a personality, or a defect in their personality, right? A lot of those terms were around at that time, but they hadn't really been understood or studied psychologically. So Freud was really at the forefront of that, kind of saying, let's develop a scientific theory that we can use to study personality, and then develop testing and therapies and models for that.
So they would define personality as, from just a basic definition, would be how a person interacts with the world and on this conscious level.
Yeah, that's a great question.
What drives the person, and is the personality something they can create or something that's a default, and those questions.
It's actually still debatable, and it's an ongoing discussion in psychology. And you go to any psychology department in any big university, and the conversation around personality is still going on. Like, how do we define this thing called personality? What is it? Does it really exist? Is it part of our ego? Is it part of consciousness? Is it just an illusion, maybe it doesn't exist at all. All those are viable kind of responses to that question.
And actually, you can go down a rabbit hole just thinking about what is personality, because it is like an ego. From Eastern philosophy, it's like kind of an aspect of the ego, which is not actually solid. So from an Eastern perspective, locking down into a personality just seems sort of counter-spiritual in a way, but also this idea that everyone has a judgment of a label of what that means. So what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be kind? What does it mean to be mean? Those personality, like that's a mean person, they have a mean personality, or they're angry. It could be very subjective.
Yeah. So there are different schools, and the big schools we can identify are some of these. So first of all, Freud and Jung, Adler, they all fall into what's called the psychodynamic schools. So psychodynamic schools are really interesting because they say the personality is not the center of yourself. It is one of the elements, one of the factors that are dynamically moving around your psyche, jostling for position and for control in a sense. But it's certainly not the totality of who you are, right? They talk about the unconscious mind, of course, and in different ways. The different psychodynamic school have different ways of formulating it. But from the Jungian perspective, it's an interesting part because he saw the personality as the mask, meaning the persona.
The social mask, right?
Yeah, it's a way that we, like a construct that we create, an app, if you will, like an application on your phone that functions to interface with the world, especially the social settings as human beings, but that it is not the true intelligence in the phone, right?
So would you say the personality is more of our conditioning in a way? Or in part,
it's based, let's say the way our mind constructs it is based in large part on conditioning, but it also comes from inheritance, of course, and from your own self-concept.
I didn't realize that when you told me that our genes actually have personality traits, tendencies, and we can turn them on and off. And then also, like growing up with our parents, and our family and our culture, we learn like how to be and what fits in. And then of course there's always the black sheep. There's always the person that doesn't fit into the family and they have a completely different personality, and like, where did they come from? So there's like that aspect of is it like nurture or nature? Which is it? And so the personality, I would say, is how people see us and how we see ourselves in the world in a social setting. And what we're capable of. Like I have a outgoing personality, or I'm an introvert. How you function in the world, but we make it like that's who we are. So in Jungian, the mask is really we forget that we're not the mask, and we end up just over-identifying with the personality versus our true nature, and that's really the whole idea of individuation. But I digress. Go continue with the
different schools. So the psychodynamic schools, and we'll come back to the psychodynamic model because it's really, for us, it's one of the most interesting ones. The other model is a cognitive model. So cognitive models, and again, there are different schools as well within that bigger umbrella. But cognitive models essentially look at our mind, our brain, as a information processing unit, right? It's designed to process information, linguistic information, symbolic information, cultural information. The cognitive function of the brain is to do that. And in its doing that, it creates this self-concept, which we call personality. And it essentially, the cognitive scientists would say, it's a cognitive construct.
So it's really about your thoughts?
Our thoughts.
The narrative?
Yeah. The kind of the story that we have. These schemas that we construct in our mind from experience, from learning. They would say that accounts for what we see and what we see as a personality in an individual. this learning, past experiences. They might take into account some genetics, some cultural history, all that.
But it's more like behavior. Would you say more cognitive behavioral falls into that?
Cognitive behavioral, I would say, is one of the schools of the cognitive schools, which they look at behavior as the output, right? The input is all that learning and information, and the output is the behavior that's going on.
And they're not really taking into account like the spirituality of a person or their soul. They're basically looking at the mechanisms of how they're functioning in the world from a kind of a conscious experience. And a lot of cognitive, do they go into the unconscious, or they just stay on the conscious level and more behavior and what they can see and experience?
Yeah, they don't talk about the unconscious per se, but we can say, well, there's some correlation between what the psychodynamic schools call the unconscious and what the cognitive scientists call schemas. Because in the schema, it's more like the big program, or that
kind of our programming.
That like our worldview, perhaps that it's in there, but we don't think about it continuously. But the mind is using it as a reference point to make sense of new information that's coming in, and also make decisions. So if you have a schema of like the world is always never sat. It's never there for me. You have that kind of like pattern of kind of like a idea, or narrative that, and then what you end up doing is anything that happens, you'll interpret as that. From that point of view. Yeah. But then where's the personality in that? The personality would be the schema of the self-concept. Like, who am I? Okay. Who am I? So it's not like a label as much as the person looks at the whole picture of the schema of the kind of the whole pattern. Yes. Okay. And they definitely the cognitive schools would put more emphasis on our awareness, our conscious life, than on the unconscious processing that's going on. Even the spiritual aspects of meditation, all that, those would be maybe considered part of the worldview, perhaps, that there is something beyond the physical realm. And of course, I'm simplifying. There are some great ideas in cognitive sciences. One of the most interesting ones, and a lot of people haven't studied or thought about behaviorism, but Skinner, who was the main proponent of behaviorism, was a brilliant mind, one of the most brilliant minds since Freud, really, and Jung, who contributed to psychology, except that his ideas were very much about looking at behavior. In other words, only observable behavior was considered to be valid information in his view. And so he got to the point where he was denying that there was even a mind there. There was even a personality. Yeah, there was no personality. It's just a robot doing and reacting. And some people think that. They kind of treat themselves as, if I just change my programming, I could change my... And so they treat themselves as a machine, and that would be behaviorism, right? If I shift my emotions and reactions to things or withhold pleasure from myself, and are addictions based on the behavioral model? Well, you can account for addiction through the behavioral model, certainly, because it has to do with rewards and punishment, operant conditioning. Everything we do, every action that we take gives us a certain result, and depending on how we interpret that result, it conditions us. So if I take an action and I sense that, I failed at this, or this gave me a negative result, I'm conditioning myself just by taking that action and kind of thinking about what it gave me. In other words, if I interpret it as a negative, I tend to decrease that behavior. If I interpret it as a positive, that behavior tends to increase. So over time, you can imagine all the actions that we're taking every day. Skinner said, we're really locked in by the environment and the actions that we take in that environment. So there's no concept of locus of control, personality, or anything in that? Yeah, his conclusion was, we're trapped. The only thing that we can do is rearrange the contingencies in the environment to help us give us a better result in the conditioning that is going on.
That's what he believed.
That's what he believed.
But we don't believe that, just to be clear. And then the neuroscientific model is really the brain, how we work, and we're going through this because you see a lot of people take pieces of these. When you're doing self-development, you're hearing these different terms.
Rewiring the brain.
Rewiring the brain, and then also changing your behavior, and then thinking positive, limiting beliefs, and then unconscious. And it's like, where do these all fall in? And they're actually different schools, and how do they fit? So neuroscientific thinking and the neuroscience of the brain, right? The brain science is huge right now. Mm-hmm. Some people would say it's the dominant school of thought right now because so much information is coming through about what the brain is and how it functions from neuroimaging, from neuropsychology, just from understanding the physical structure of the brain and its computational power. That people say, this is the way to go, right? Why do we need all these other schools when this is giving us so much data and so much information? And there is some point to that, of course. This school would say that personality is essentially created by brain functioning. All these billions of neurons firing at once create a sense of myself experiencing the world. But neuroscience gives us some interesting information because it says, really, you're not really perceiving a reality out there. The sensory data is kind of collected by the brain, and then the brain creates a three-dimensional virtual reality that you experience. So when you look at the world, what you're experiencing is your brain processing this information and creating this world for you, not just you looking out at the world and kind of observing what's out there. So it's fascinating, right? It's giving us a very different perspective on what's going on and what the brain is doing. And so all of these things you're talking about, how does that relate to personality testing and what can we take from those, what you're talking about right now?
So I think at the end of the day,
defining a personality.
At the end of the day, if we look at the history of personality theories and then the way testing has evolved, it's important to look at, first of all, a little bit at the history. So the way I was trained, and I haven't done assessments in about 10 years, so I'm sure there's been evolution. But the way I was trained is that no matter what the tests say, what the scores you get from testing somebody, especially around personality, the clinician, the well-trained clinician or assessor has to make the call as to what is going on with the individual. In other words, the information doesn't come from the test itself.
So a lot of people are taking personality tests, like even these bigger ones, the more popular ones, and then they take that one test and they make a decision about who they are from that one test, which is inaccurate, you're saying. I mean, it's it's part of the picture, but not the whole picture?
Yes, part of the picture. That's another factor, that assessment is never one test. You never make a call from one test. It's a battery of tests. And the more, the better. The more information that you have, the better. And of course, there's a clinical interview, a history, a kind of consideration of family, culture, environment. So
there's a lot of factors. And then also the timing when they take the test. So if, say you take a test when you're in like a high stress situation where you just got divorced or lost a family member, and you're taking a test, or lost a job, and you're in a different state of mind, you're going to answer those questions much differently, like this idea of states or traits, that we do have, our personality isn't so fixed. Even on the programming and our self-concept, there's room for evolution, and there's room for, even just on a conscious level, based on the environment, we can change. And I know this for a fact, for me, is I can be really outgoing and extroverted with my family, but when I'm with new people, sometimes I can be more shy. So how do you answer that question? Am I an introvert or an extrovert? And then I think what happens is that people, especially these new, like there's all the like pop psychology, like theories out there, and they're all saying, I'm this type or that type. And then what happens is that a person just takes one test, and then they start living their whole life around the test and that definition, what I find is limiting, because we evolve. We don't, first of all, there's the states or traits, the one test, and then we evolve. We are always evolving. So if we kind of say, I'm this, I'm an introvert, and that's just how I am, you actually are limiting yourself. And even Jung says that when he came up with the types, the personality types, he said what he realized was that he's not one type, but that he can be introverted, and then as he individuates, your personality changes. So I think the bottom line is, a lot of the understanding where they come from, and then understanding that if you think of yourself as just that mask, just that persona, you're going to be very limiting, because then you kind of, it limits you and puts a label on you, and then you're done.
Yeah, and another part of this is some of the diagnostic labels that are used in clinical psychology then are thrown around in popular culture,
yes,
like narcissism, without proper assessment and proper testing. Mm-hmm. And that's not only unethical, right? But it's really not humanistic to think in terms of labeling people with these very harsh judgments and diagnoses.
It's a very, very heavy. I mean, we all can be narcissistic in certain ways, but to say that you are narcissistic, I mean, that's all that person is.
Yeah, and even if the person has been tested and found to be diagnosed as narcissistic, well, that means there's a mental health problem. Not so much that they're evil or the bad.
They're trying to hurt you.
Yeah, it's more that we should be compassionate and try to help them find ways for them to deal with these personality disorders. I
have a good example of in a lighter way. Talk about personality, and maybe this is the cognitive part, and maybe you can tell me what school this is in. But when I first started reading personal development when I was in the 80s, there was not much out there. There wasn't the internet, so you kind of went to the bookstore the old-fashioned way, and you're reading books by therapists. There really wasn't coaches back then, so it was really based on this dysfunction that you have. Like everything was about you have some kind of dysfunction if your life isn't working. So I bought the book Codependent No More, because I read somewhere that when you're needy and you're insecure and you need, because I was trying to figure out why I was single and why no men would love me, and I was like, oh, I'm codependent, and I was like, oh, I got a label now. Now I know what's wrong with me. But the problem was, I thought that was a death sentence, a life sentence, that I'm always going to be codependent, and I'm going to have to cope with it. I'm codependent, so I'm going to have to be careful. I have to keep stronger boundaries, or da-da-da-da-da. And then I really felt like this kind of label on me kept me limited and broken in a way.
Sure.
So what school does codependency come from? Is that another pop word, or is that cognitive, or?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, several different schools use it, but I would say it's more of a therapy model, right? That in clinical psychology, counseling psychology, people are working with clients, and they use different models. So most people are eclectic in that sense, that they will use often different models that they think would fit the situation. And the idea of codependency or family systems, those kind of ideas are often used to help people through relationship problems or those.
But don't you find like it just seemed like everyone had codependency in the like it's almost like we have this like pop theory that everyone starts to feel like everyone has this now, you know, and so that's kind of how I felt. And no one really talks about codependency anymore, really. Maybe in AA meetings or something, I don't know. But it just seems like it's not in the ethos of popular culture anymore. It's just kind of like, oh, that's old school. So I'm showing my age, everyone. But it really did, like at first it was good because it helped me identify behavior that I was, why, you know, what that was. And I do think that there is value to understanding your personality in a way from these different systems, because it really shows where you're at. So you get a better understanding. And one of the things that we do in our Jungian training is we do have a personality. It's not a personality test. We call it the persona test, because it's really not about your personality, but more about the mask that you wear, the role you play, more the character that you are. Much deeper than just traits, but more of like kind of like the system they're embodying. And Toni Wolff took it from Carl Jung's idea of the personality types, and she took it and she said, well, women kind of have like a thinking mind or a feeling or intuitive, and so she brought the 4 archetypes, which is what we do in our coach training. We have the mother, the lover, the professional, and the mystic. And so we have the intuitive, the thinker, the emotional one, and then the nurturing, like family person. But she really saw that, and a lot of our clients say, oh, okay, now I know where I am and what my patterns are. So now I can know where I want to go. So it kind of gives you a starting point, but it never should be the life sentence. It never should be, oh, I'm a mother type, so I'm always going to be pleasing. I'm never going to keep boundaries, and I'm always going to feel responsible for everyone. But to know that that's your tendency, and then to step outside of it, that's really the key.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the dangers of kind of the uncontrolled or kind of pop psychology testing, is that often people don't understand what the information is telling them. That it is just kind of a surface reflection of certain traits or certain aspects of their behavior.
It's like not even your whole conscious mind. It's just a very small sliver.
Yeah.
And then to make a huge assumption of your whole being based on that test is really, it does you a disservice in a way.
Yes, and the other way around, that people often would point at somebody and say they are a certain label, right? They're narcissistic or even depressed or anxious. Often those labels stick to people, and they're always seen in this light instead of seeing them as a human being before anything else. And we know that that's a powerful thing. I used to do a lot of testing with kids with learning disabilities and different developmental problems. Often it impacted their lives in every possible way, because the diagnosis is meant to help them receive the kind of services that they need. And
it's the system of the medical and insurance industry, right?
Yes, but socially, the kid has to go out there and compete or exist with other kids they're doing good, right? They don't have those labels on them, and so they always kind of tend to see themselves as broken, as deficient, somehow disabled by.
And they're in the
labels.
special class, and then they're given this kind of different and
yes, and if we apply that principle to the labels that are thrown around, like narcissist or borderline or any of those personality disorders, without proper testing and assessment, right? We're doing this we're labeling people in a very harsh way. And some of these labels could stick, and then the person kind of feels broken or dysfunctional throughout their life because of these kind of social stigmas that go along with.
And not to say these things don't exist, because there are people who have mental illness, and we want to help identify them. It's the way the system works. I think I remember when I was a hypnotherapist and I did insurance, I had a supervisor, And in order to get my sessions through insurance, we had to give them a diagnosis. And it was always like generalized anxiety disorder. And I always felt bad even writing that down because they were just coming to quit smoking or lose weight. They didn't have like a disorder, and it just felt so heavy to me. It just felt wrong, but it was the system and how we worked it. And I talked to my supervisor about it all the time. I said, I feel kind of bad. Like they're not disordered. But then if someone read that on their form, it's on their record. I mean, it's on their medical record. And so it just has a heavier. So I think we overdiagnose people, and then there's also the undiagnosed people, people that don't seek help, that do have serious illnesses. And the thing is not to make fun of them or like make them wrong for who they are, because they don't have the capacity. And actually anyone, even people that without mental illness, just people in general acting out of their conditioning, most people don't act out of their conscious higher self. Most people are just reacting and acting out of their programming. So it's about bringing more compassion, but also possibility to people, even if they do get a label or a diagnosis, that you can see them out of it. One of the that story, The Beautiful Mind, they didn't know what was wrong, and then when they labeled him schizophrenic, I went, oh, okay, now I know what I have to deal with. And then he tried to find a way to work with it, and he found a way to integrate it into his life and have his regular life and still have his diagnosis. So other people would just lock him up in a place or over medicate him, and he fought to and it's a true story. He fought to create a new way of working with it and managing it, and he attributed it to his wife, and he said love was really the key to moving it from trying to figure it out logically to on the heart. And so if that extreme case can show us a possibility for people. So if you have a little insecurity, or if you're codependent, that you don't have to be married to that label for the rest of your life. And then you want to have it inform maybe give you some information, make sure you get it from not just self-assessing and then trying to diagnose yourself and block yourself in an image, but get a coach to help you understand who you are, or a therapist if you're dealing with something more serious.
Yeah, in that respect, I think psychology as a profession has failed society by not providing more information to the public, like not making it part of psychologists' agenda to teach people what is the mind and how does it work and what do these labels mean. So often people are left to their own devices, right? And if you look on the internet, you're going to get all kinds of weird information, some good, some bad, most of it in between. And that's not a good way to for the public to educate themselves.
I see a lot of people self-diagnosing other people, like they're reading online, Wikipedia or WebMD, and that's, that person has this or that. So when we talk about empowerment and we talk about Jungian coaching, which is our baby, our sweet spot, how does the personality, taking like maybe the assessment of, we have the persona assessment, how can those tests be a part of individuation?
Yeah.
And then what's possible beyond that?
Yeah, I think just understanding that it's any test, first of all, is not giving you like an X-ray kind of showing you something that's true and valid in your mind, in your psyche, and who you are. It's essentially a tool that can provide some information, but it's a starting point, only a starting point. So in that regard, some of these Meyers-Briggs and Big Five, or some of the tests that we developed and use, they're entry points into a deeper discussion of what's going on in your life, right? How can you work with these traits, or
where are your tendencies right now, but in a way of how can we change? But it's not. This is who you are. I think there's a difference between. With a personality test, you're really thinking that's who you are. It's just what your conditioning is expressing.
Absolutely.
So if we kind of separate it, and in Jungian coaching we call it, there's a true personality, which is our true self, which is much different than our surface behaviors. So don't you want to find out what that is versus just that conditioned personality that we've been learned to do that can change with the wind and based on circumstances and environments.
Yeah, and I doubt that the true personality could be assessed through testing. Maybe in the future, maybe through neuroscience and neuroimaging, we might be able to see big changes in the brain when people undergo this transformation of the self.
Well, I know that everyone can take, like, people that have gone through the shadow work and individuation process that we teach. Our students seem like they look younger. Their faces glow. They're just relaxed. They just feel so much more energy. Like, there's so many changes that they know something has changed. And I think one of the main things is their self-concept changes. They stop believing they're this personality, and they start believing and understanding from a deeper place of who they really are and what's possible in their life and what they can create. And so I don't think personality tests are ruining your life, but they can if you just believe that's all you are. I think that's the message we want to send to you.
Like any power, it's how you use it. Right? And if you misuse it or misunderstand it and apply it in a kind of a general way where you're believing that it's telling you something true about yourself and something permanent, then it could ruin your life. And then, if we project that onto people and label people, and we think, or we define them by those labels, that's the danger right there.
And we do that all the time. I mean, we're social creatures, so we're always trying to define other people by their behavior, and then we make, that's their personality. And someone's behavior isn't necessarily their personality, because we've all had that yelling or unhappy conversation with a customer service representative, or getting a rude customer service person talking to us. We've always had that, or someone cutting us in line and we're like, or road rage a little bit. We've all had a little bit of that. Well, you're saying not me, but you know what I'm saying? But if someone took that snapshot of us and that one little sliver of time and said, that's who that person is. Can you imagine you had a bad day, and just lost your job, and you're going into Starbucks and you didn't realize the line was there, and someone yells at you and you yell back, and then they think, what is that angry woman, she's full of anger, that angry personality. And then just from that 5-minute interaction. So that's a lot of times what we do. And then with this work, when we work with the shadow, you're actually looking at your own projection of what you're pushing away. You see it in other people, personality traits that you don't accept about yourself. And then when you start doing shadow work, you really start to cultivate more compassion and really notice, and then you're softening your own self-judgment of yourself. And when you have a bad day and when you act out, you're not defined by, I'm a bad person now because I did this or that. And a lot of us, we're going to talk about that in a future episode of how being a bad person is not always a good person is not always a bad thing, how it can be a bad thing, because it really, that personality is not, like we say, the life sentence. It's just a very fluid part of our floaty surface self. Surface self, you like that?
Yeah, so the bottom line is we want to definitely encourage people to take the reins of their own mental wellness by learning as much as they can about the mind. That includes taking tests if they wish to. But to be aware of what these things are telling you and how what is the proper use of these things. Also
question it. Does this feel right? In our tests, we always tell our coaches when they administer the tests that we have, we check with the client. How do they feel? Let them look at the different models, and this feels more like me. And you always let the client decide. Mm-hmm. What are your views on ADHD? Is it a product of conditioning? Is that something to do with neurological makeup of the brain?
Yeah, again, if it depends on what model you use to look at it. But the current thinking is that it is a neurologically based problem. The language centers in the brain are very new. If you think about our evolution, we've only recently started to speak and use language as to communicate. And so when anything goes awry in development, let's say in utero when the baby's forming or during the birthing process, one of the first things that goes is those language centers, right? There might be just a little alteration in the hormones or the neurotransmitters at a certain time, or some slight injury, and the child may have problems in ADHD, attention, hyperactivity, those kind of things.
But also, that's a great question, because a lot of people think, well, I have ADHD or ADD, and that's just who I am, and it's, well, no, you can work with it. You can learn to, like, I worked when I was doing hypnosis, I did a lot of working with kids, and we would have them focus on their third eye and just create stimulating the frontal lobe of the brain, giving them focus. And so there's a lot, and there's treatments for it, right? That help them focus. And we don't of course there's medication too, but there's non-medication ways to treat ADD and ADHD.
Well, absolutely. And the whole question of medication, of course, is another podcast that we should do, because it's a big topic. And kids often don't have choices, right, in the way they're treated. The adults often make the choices. And parents, especially, because they don't have access to a lot of, let's say, options, they don't have a lot of options, they will often go with the medication option. That
it's probably less expensive than taking them to treatment or having one-on-one, behavioral training, to kind of help them with. But there are definitely, I know some non-medical ways to work with it, that non-medicated ways to work with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we'd love to see a podcast on medication. Yeah, that's another one. So I really love this idea of personality, and because we tend to think we are a personality. We tend to think, oh, I'm funny, or I'm this way, and we lock ourselves into these limiting ideas of ourselves, and then the test can actually reinforce those ideas or give us new ideas that we didn't think of, and so it's a good point. And I really like the idea too that sometimes they can help us. Like for me, understanding, codependency, there's a word for this, is trying to figure out my whole idea. And so it gives you kind of a framework to start with. So you're not just thinking, I felt like I was just unlovable, and I'm like, oh, okay, there's this pattern. But then it just became, that's me, and I can't do anything about it. This is what you do, and this is how you behave. And there was no answer to how to change it. It was more like diagnosing without ability to change. And we definitely want to have the personality test, but then what are we going to do to transcend that personality, create the true personality, be who we want to be versus who we've been conditioned to be?
Absolutely. And certainly if we look at the Eastern philosophy then, which kind of goes at the spiritual level, we are not our individual mind. And the ultimate teaching of the wisdom traditions is that we can transform our own mind by working on it, by paying attention to it, right? By self-inquiry, meditation, looking inward, we can transform our personality regardless of any diagnosis, of any past history, any situation. And for somebody for this example, somebody is asking about ADHD, there's pretty good research that meditation, even the practice of yoga, it helps with attention. It helps focus the mind, and it helps in overall functioning.
I think when we are searching, we are desperate for an answer. Yeah. And then we think, okay, well, I got an answer, and then we just don't. But then we think that's the end. And the personality test should be the beginning, not the end. Like, not the, okay, this is who I am.
Right.
Now I have a label, and it's like, oh, okay, this is who I've been. Who do I want to become? And we're not limited by our personality, whether it's genetic, whether it's conditioned. We can become whoever we want to be. And that, I am an introvert. I am doing a podcast on a video on YouTube. If I can do it, you can do it. So So I'm not an introvert. I'm a recovering introvert, I guess I would say.
And this is from our perspective, there's been a kind of an over-medicalization of everything. I mean, you name it. Everything is medicalized.
Diagnosing.
And it's seen through the lens of disorder, right? Of medication, of fixing and trauma. And to some extent, that's okay, right? Because people do need to develop those systems to help people that do have trauma, do have some kind of disorder. But often those labels then translate into the culture, and then the whole culture becomes about over-medicalizing everything when it's just human nature. It's just things that we can deal with in a creative, positive way.
Yeah, it almost feels like everyone wants to be a therapist, and everyone wants to think they need therapy, and it's really not. There's a reason therapy exists. It's to help mental illness. Just being human is challenging, but the challenges doesn't mean we have an illness or we have a disorder. And I think, and especially with life coaching, it's unregulated. So there's no one kind of watching the shop to make sure that people aren't, it's like, and the internet is, Wild West. Yeah. Anything goes. So we hope that our podcast brings that kind of intellectualization and theory and research into what we teach, and give you the real stuff.
Yeah. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time, where we'll continue our series on personality. We're
going to talk about trauma next week. So that also has been this big, it just seems it's everywhere now. Like, everyone has trauma. Everyone talks about it. So we're going to talk about what it is, what it isn't, and how to work with it. So since it's in the conversation right now, and so yes, and the last question is: this looking for an external fix rather than looking inward? I don't know what you mean when you mean by this, but most people, we're conditioned to look for something outside of us instead of looking in, and knowing that we have the inner resources to do it. And in coaching, we're really not fixing anyone. We're not healing anyone. We're helping the client, empowering the client to find their own answers, to guide them to their own answers, to guide them to actually help them understand how navigate that inward journey, versus I'm going to do something to you and fix you, because we don't see our clients as broken. We see you all with potential. So even if you have a mental illness, there's potential. Like, there's no limit to the human potential.
Thanks for watching.
Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.